Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this program, the Commonwealth Club of California, on challenges and opportunities facing the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities. I'm Dennis Wu, past chair of the Commonwealth Club Board of Directors, Governors, current chair of SF Cause, and your chair for today's program. Today's program is with Erica Marasuko, Deputy Assistant to President Biden and White House Senior Liaison for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, and Krista Kai, Executive Director, White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. This program is being held in partnership with SF Cause, San Francisco Community Alliance for Unity, Safety, and Education. Thank you to everyone coming out this afternoon, and thank you to all of you viewing this program live online. A reminder, please be sure to turn off all technology. Anything that buzzes, beeps, lights up, everyone in this room and online would appreciate it. I got rid of my phone. So, a reminder that we welcome your questions. Question cards will be collected throughout the program, and for those of you online, please use the chat feature in YouTube to share your questions. And we'll be sure the moderator gets these as well. For those of you who may not be familiar with question cards, they're on your seat, and there'll be other cards that will be passed around. Right? This is an example of them. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our guest this afternoon. Moderating today's program is Julian Chang, a community affairs specialist with a proven track record of creating linkages between donors, beneficiaries, community stakeholders, and public officials. His expertise include representing global Fortune 25 companies in matching corporate donors and not-for-profits to develop win-win alliances and partnerships. Julian will be leading the discussion today with our special guests, Erica Marasuko and Krista Kai. And now, I would like to welcome up to the Commonwealth Club stage. Welcome. Julian, Erica, Krista.
Welcome, especially Erica and Crystal, to San Francisco on such a beautiful day. Erica Marasuko serves as the Deputy Assistant to the President and for the AA and NHPI communities. She's also Senior Liaison in the White House. Crystal Kai is the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Together, they engage our AA and NHPI communities, leaders, and also organizers in issues such as safety, justice, inclusion, and opportunity through a whole of government approach that is crucial to our understanding of racial and social equity in today's America. I will want to say that it's my personal pleasure to meet them because we've been working together over Zoom for the last little bit in COVID, so it's wonderful to be able to be together. Now, before we get into the questions that I have for you and that the audience has for you, I'd like to hear a little bit about the priorities that you have.
Mind if I start? Go ahead. Julian, thank you. Dennis, thank you. You all are leaders amongst leaders. The SF Cause team and Commonwealth Club, thank you for welcoming me back. This is my second tour, this one in person. The last one was virtual due to the pandemic last September, and it's an honor to be back here with y'all. As Julian mentioned, I'm Erica Marasuko. I'm one of the President's deputies, and I serve as the first ever Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Senior Liaison in the West Wing, which is the honor I get to serve to not create create anything, but to build on and expand on the president and the vice president's commitment to our communities that pre-existed long before they were sworn in. And so this is an honor to be able to keep building on that and making good and demonstrate and continue to advancing the priority that the president and the vice president place on our communities. Internally, my role is to make sure that the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander perspectives, goals, hopes, and the challenges are brought to bear and taken into consideration as we work across all policy areas and all political areas. Externally, I serve as not just the face of the administration, coming out to wonderful events like this, to meet with wonderful community leaders and community members like you, but also to make sure that there's a dynamic kind of information loop, that when we're trying to be as inclusive and impactful as possible in the policy and political considerations that we make in the West Wing, that it's informed by and in real time updated with the needs and the challenges and your viewpoints as community members. Local community leaders are also community members, and I think Crystal would agree, since we both had our start in the Congress, we would not want to do this without you. And so I take my charge very seriously to make sure that we don't just recognize in Washington, D.C., the richness and diversity of our Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities, but that we're also listening and hearing and seeing and value the diverse and rich experiences. I don't do this work alone. I do it in close partnership with my very dear friend and colleague, Crystal Ka'ai, who runs our initiative and our President's Advisory Commission. We also work closely with Howard Oh, who directs our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander outreach from the Office of Public Engagement at the White House. I also have the benefit of working across all components within the White House and in the interagency process with all of the policy councils in the White House and all of the support components like intergovernmental affairs, so that I can interact with local and state leaders, with congressional affairs, so that we can interact with the federal Congress, with comms, and digital, to make sure that we're communicating as effectively as possible. One of the things that brings us back, back to San Francisco, back to the Commonwealth Club, is because of the spike in anti-Asian hate and violence, which is, I think, top of mind for many of us, because it's wrapped up in this large kind of canvas of what it looks like to live through and endure the pandemic, and what post-pandemic world looks like when the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities have been hit so hard, not just in terms of the public health impacts that all communities have faced, but the rise of anti-Asian hate and violence, coupled with the disproportionate impact that the economic crisis has had on our small businesses in our communities. And we have the benefit of a president and a vice president who truly see this, and that is our charge collectively, and one of the reasons why it's so important for us to be able to be in community with each other and in close conversations. So with that, I will turn it over to friend and colleague.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Dennis. Thank you to SF Cause and the Commonwealth Club for hosting us today. My name is Crystal Ka'ai, and I'm the Executive Director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, or what we call WIONP for short, as well as the President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And Erica did a really great job outlining, I think, we are so fortunate under this administration, the Biden-Harris administration, to really have leadership from the very top who truly see our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, and who value input from our communities and want to ensure that as we talk about equity and ensuring that traditionally overlooked and underserved communities are included in the work of our federal government, that we are truly including all communities, including the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander population. And so our White House initiative, unlike Erica's historic role, our White House initiative has actually existed for over 2 decades. It was first created in 1999 under the Clinton administration. And so it has existed for over 20 years. And currently we were reauthorized and reinvigorated last May through the signing of Executive Order 14031 that President Biden signed in May of last year during AA and NHPI Heritage Month. And that executive order reestablished but also reinvigorated and expanded this initiative. And so for the first time in history, Native Hawaiians are explicitly named and included in the executive order. And our White House initiative includes three major components. It includes our Federal Interagency Working Group, which is comprised of over 40 federal departments and agencies that collectively work together to ensure that we are able to coordinate across the entirety of the federal government to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. It also includes a regional network comprised of over 400 federal officials all across the country based in our 10 federal regions who are really our boots on the ground and help to ensure that local communities all across the country are connected directly with the federal government and with federal resources. And actually just yesterday I was in Los Angeles where we did a roundtable where we were able to bring together community leaders, state and local officials, as well as our federal government officials to be able to share resources. And we're so honored to be here in San Francisco to be able to connect directly with all of you too, because so much of our work cannot happen without the input and direct engagement of local communities on the ground. It's so important for us to be able to hear from you, to be able to elevate issues impacting our communities really at the highest levels, and to ensure that the federal government is accessible and responsive to the diverse needs of our communities. And so that is a big part of the work that we are doing through our regional network apparatus of our federal officials who are based all across the country, from Hawaii and our Pacific Islands to our East Coast and everywhere in between. And then lastly, we have our President's Advisory Commission on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And that entity is comprised of 25 officials who were appointed by the President to really serve as a way to provide independent recommendations to the President on ways to advance opportunities for our Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. And it does include several commissioners from California, including a handful from the Bay Area. So we're really grateful for their expertise that they provide to us in terms of ways that we can better really address some of the challenges and barriers that have long persisted in our communities. That is such an important work. Such important work to do now more than ever. And Erica mentioned, the alarming rise in anti-Asian hate we have seen over the course of the pandemic, and also just knowing that so many long-standing inequities have been truly exacerbated over the past 2 years. Whether we're talking about health disparities, economic disparities, educational disparities, housing, so many of these challenges have really been laid bare over the past nearly 2.5 years. And so it is so important now more than ever that we are truly responsive as we're looking to on our ongoing, relief and recovery efforts for the pandemic, that we are truly inclusive of our diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities and can ensure that they have a voice in our federal government.
Thank you, Erica and Crystal. That was really comprehensive. I know that, like me, you probably have questions. And there are volunteers who will receive your questions. If you write your questions down, she will bring it up to me, and I'll sort through them. I can't guarantee I will get through all of them. If you're online, you're welcome to put it in the chat, and then it'll be printed out and sent up. Time permitting, hopefully we'll get to as many questions as we can. You mentioned anti-Asian hate. You mentioned ANHPI representation, and you also mentioned economic recovery from COVID, which are all the three topic broad areas that we want to cover today. Specifically, we want to hear from you who can help, what resources are out there, how do we access those resources if we are a member of an organization or if we're an individual or a business owner. And so these are the really practical things that is within the spirit of the Commonwealth Club, because it started off as a forum to share information among the agricultural community to find best practices. And so we are right in the wheelhouse of the Commonwealth Club. Thank you. I want to start off by something that is dear to my heart. 2 weeks ago, there was the 1-year anniversary of the tragic killings of Asian women in Atlanta. those killings represent an emotional response that we are having in America, from San Francisco to New York, from the north to the south, of unsafety and feeling like we cannot go out to shop, or even when we go out to shop, we might be mugged. Here in San Francisco, just a couple of days ago, on Stockton Street, an elderly woman had her phone snatched away from her. Two very brave people chased down and recovered the phone, and then helped the police apprehend that perpetrator. But it brings to mind, what federal resources do you have? Can you please talk about the Office of Justice Programs, for example, as one of the resources that we can access?
Sure. So, yes, the Department of Justice has been largely leading the efforts from the federal government to address this rise in anti-Asian hate and hate crimes. And I had mentioned our federal interagency working group through the White House Initiative. We are working very closely with Department of Justice, and including the OJP. You mentioned the Office of Justice Programs. They have a Bureau of Justice Statistics, and so through that bureau, they actually conduct a national crime victimization survey, which is our nation's primary source of information on criminal victimization. And they also have a number of grants and other just technical assistance resources that they provide to states and localities to really ensure that we're able to address, hate crimes impacting our communities. And so one of the grants that they have is specifically for law enforcement prosecution training and resources, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Program. And so that program supports state, local, and tribal law enforcement and prosecution agencies and their partners in conducting outreach, education, and also other forms of engagement with local communities. They also have other grants, the Edward Brin Memorial Justice Assistance Grant Program, that provides funding to support a range of criminal justice programming, including those that combat hate crimes. And I also know that more recently, in the omnibus that the president signed for funding, that there was also funds that were provided specifically for grants to community-based organizations. And so that has yet to be administered, but the OJP is working right now to be able to hopefully distribute those funds in the future. And I know that was a big request we received from community leaders, not just having it funding go to law enforcement, but also going directly into the communities, knowing that so many of our nonprofit organizations and other community-based organizations have really stepped up over the course of the pandemic to provide that safety for our communities, knowing that so many, unfortunately, don't feel comfortable going to law enforcement. So it is really important to also ensure that we're funding not just our state and local law enforcement agencies, but also our community-based organizations directly on the ground, who we know are trusted resources for so many within the Asian American community. And it's so important, again, they're providing language assistance, they're providing cultural competency on ways to address this really alarming surge in anti-Asian hate we have witnessed over the course of the pandemic.
So what I hear you saying is that not only are you just training the law enforcement with statistics and other tools, but also it trickles down to individuals by going to trusted community members, and that's part of what's going to help them feel a little bit safer. But part of the emotional toll is that feeling of uncertainty. So when you're talking about the emotional effect of public safety, what can people do, especially with the federal government, to reach out to boost that feeling of well-being?
The first thing I would say is to be able to name and acknowledge and honor that pain. San Francisco Police had just released a couple of months ago their data for reported hate crimes for the last calendar year was a 567% increase. And the toll that takes on our psyches when we worry about the treasures of our community, our elders and our children, being able to operate and live their lives in public spaces. When you look at the hate crime statistics that are reported to the FBI, most of the hate crimes that are reported, and again, I emphasize reported because these are by no means comprehensive for reasons that we can talk about. I could talk about for a really, really long time. I've spent a couple of decades talking about it. That these are folks who are just living their everyday lives, going shopping, going to school, going to work, being at work, and having to isolate ourselves is a deep impact that I think that our community would be well served to be able to acknowledge and honor and be able to speak about a little bit more openly, because that's where the healing begins. We're in grief, we're in trauma, and how do you turn the page in that from that perspective? One of the things that I also hope that the community can take a little solace in, while again we are in the throes of trauma, every individualized incident of hate or murder that's reported in the press definitely impacts the family and the local community, but it also has these national reverberations of reinforcing how unsafe we feel and how little security we feel, even just living our lives with our family in society. And so for that, again, I take some confidence in a lot of the accomplishments and strides that we've taken in the past year since the Biden-Harris administration has been in office, with their leadership, understanding their commitment to our communities to be able to ensure the safety and security that we should expect, and I think that we can now hope for. On the first week in office, they issued a presidential memorandum condemning racism, intolerance, and xenophobia against the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community, an all-of-government approach. On the first week in office, he signed the hate crimes, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that was sponsored by Senator Hirono and Representative Grace Meng. A year before it was passed on a bipartisan basis after the Atlanta spa murders, because it had captured the imaginations and planted the necessity of having stronger hate crimes disciplines because of the trauma that our community was facing with these iterative and horrific examples of murders and violence. We're investing in research to examine both the causes of and the solutions for the hate. We're translating more materials in language. I mean, one piece that would be lost inside the Beltway or for our agencies is that to ensure safety and security, sometimes a language access could be the matter of life and death. If you don't know who to call, if you don't know who to trust, or if you call somebody and you're on hold for 15 minutes because you cannot communicate effectively. Crystal described the emboldening and the reinvigoration of CSRS, the CRS programs. And I was wondering if I could just double down on one other thing, which is just last month, the president made it very, very clear as one of his platform pillar national unity agendas, an investment in the mental health crisis that our nation is suffering. He made it a high priority in his State of the Union. He's committed to working with our partners, both in community and in the government, state, local, and federal partners, to ensure that there's more supply diversity for these kinds of commitments and resources. And it includes, I wrote it down because there's a lot, $700 million in behavioral health programs, $225 million in HHS awards to train folks to serve and reach traditionally disadvantaged communities, and more community-based mobile crisis representative services, which are the cultural competency that I think for our community in particular, we really need to be cautious and sensitive to how to crack the code, to be able to talk about these things openly and feel safe in safe spaces to do that. These are just a couple of examples of resources that are online, but it is by no means over and done with. We have so much work to do.
So some of the resources you mentioned that I heard was that there's an office for victims of crime, and that there is an office called the Community Relations Service of the Justice Department. How do those differ, and how does someone who has experienced or whose grandparent or friend has experienced crime as a victim access those?
So I would actually say that most of the grant funding and the programs and the programming that CRS and the FBI put online happen at the local level, in hopefully, ideally, in partnership with local community leaders and community-based organizations. And so there is, hopefully this has been your observation and experience, a greater presence of accessibility and knowledge about these programs and their availability. Again, just to reiterate, another example is the investment that the federal government is making in doing in-language translations, the encouragement that we are implementing but not codifying to make sure that grant seekers, build in translation and effective, culturally competent community outreach mechanisms so that we're actually speaking in a trusted way through trusted voices in a way that resonates so that people can take advantage of it. Crystal, I would.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think one thing, that people don't realize too, or may realize, but it's just how sprawling the federal government is. So even a, department like the Department of Justice has many, divisions within it and components. And so, I think with the Community Relations Service, where they differ from other entities like the FBI, which are also within the DOJ, is that they really are, boots on the ground. And actually for Region 9 here in Northern California, one of our leads, and I'm not sure if he's in the audience still or not, but is actually from CRS within DOJ. And so he does a lot of our outreach and engagement here in the Bay Area. And it's so important for people not to just go to the FBI, because we know, unfortunately, a lot of our communities are hesitant to report to law enforcement, due to a number of reasons, whether they're, maybe undocumented and are afraid to come forward or just don't feel comfortable working directly with law enforcement. But other components of DOJ, like the Community Relations Services, really help to provide those resources directly in community in a trusted space where you're not going to law enforcement necessarily, but still able to have those conversations, have resources shared. And so, that is, I think people should see the Department of Justice's CRS as a tool, as a resource to them, as a way to be able to report the concerns that they're feeling, to report hate crimes, and also to learn more about some of the federal resources. And then with the Office of Justice Programs, a lot of that is more kind of administering our federal, how do we, once we have funding approved by Congress, how do we actually administer that funding directly to state and local law enforcement, to community organizations if there are grants available. So that's kind of the more of a technical role that they play in really being able to ensure that funding is getting out really, from the federal government into state and local communities across the
Let's talk about that. Okay. So you've mentioned that there's a lot of funding that's going forward, which we're grateful for. However, I think that there is among some a feeling that there is a mainstream funding pot of a lot of money, and then there's another funding pot for minorities or people of color. And so we're, as people of color, fighting, the AANHPI community is fighting with other communities of color for this limited, smaller pot of money. Is that true?
Do you mind if I start?
Go ahead.
Because I feel strongly about this in terms of like the scarcity mentality that communities of color seem to harbor in terms of a false narrative that doesn't need to exist. Yes, money is fungible, but it's also finite. But common cause and coalition with other communities of color is is the path forward, so that it isn't, and you use this word, fight with each other, and fight for funding out of that small pie. Like, we need to expand the pie for sure. And you also have more and more people like Crystal and me making sure that the unique needs of the Asian American, Native, Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander in the host of traditionally marginalized and victimized and vulnerable populations are heard and tailored to. I think that if you were to zoom way out and look at the statistics, if we were just to look at hate crimes that are reported or hate incidents, which are not, the criminal penalty enhancement, but civil penalty for discrimination and hate that's expressed through like education and housing, we are not alone, and we are stronger together. And banding together and recognizing those commonalities while also naming the differences and the uniqueness and tailoring those programs is the way that it's always worked best. And I think is the pathway for a more robust future too.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree with Erica. It's, it is not productive to think of this as a scarcity mentality. And this administration has really prioritized equity across the board for all communities, including ours. So, when Erica talked about, yes, there's finite funding, but we have expanded the pot of funding across the board. And, this is not just for, we have to fight against other communities of color for scarce funding. It is really when we're talking about how do we ensure safety for Americans. We're talking about all Americans. And so I just wanted to flag too, I think coalition building is so important. We have our White House initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, but we also have sister initiatives in the Black, Latinx, as well as Native American communities. And we work very closely together because we find that more often than not, a lot of the same challenges that we are seeing in the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community, as Erica mentioned, are also being faced by other communities. And so, where we can work together collectively to ensure that we're uplifting our collective concerns and able to get, funding tied to that will help all of our communities and uplift all of us. That is something we look to do. And then, of course, where we have unique circumstances like what we are seeing with this rise in anti-Asian hate, making sure that we also have broader partners who are going to help us to elevate our concerns and our voices at the highest levels and ensure that we have that, again, that collaboration, that support, that allyship, I think is so critical. And it's something that we are very intentionally working on through the federal government.
One of the commonalities that cuts across all communities, regardless of color, is gun violence. And that obviously plays into the feeling of mental stress and mental health. After lockdown, it's interesting, if you look at the statistics during strict lockdown, gun violence was quite low, or mass shootings was quite low, and then all of a sudden it has come back. Can you address what efforts can we do across communities to build safety, especially on this one issue of gun violence?
It's interesting that you raised that because when Crystal and I were in Atlanta with the local community leaders and some of the families, victims, and we actually deliberately tried to, our intentionality in going there was not to be, Washington, D.C. politicos making, broad policy speeches, because again, this is a community that is still in trauma. These are families who are still mourning, and yet using their voices with generosity and courage to share their stories so that these things don't happen again. Mental health and gun violence were things that the families raised with us because of the tragic consequences that we see, because there are root causes that, if addressed properly, wouldn't lead to the deadly consequences and this ex post kind of hand-wringing and tearing hair out, which is why, from the administration's perspective, this is a top priority of the president's. President Biden has done more in his 1 year in office through executive order and executive actions than any president. Top lines, and again, I wrote this down because there's a lot, and so I'm not going to give you the laundry list of it, but, through the American Rescue Plan, we had $350 billion to state and local governments for community-oriented policing. Health and Human Services was working on a way to get Medicaid reimbursements for community violence interventions. The Department of Justice, FBI, ATF, DEA, and Marshal Service are coordinating closely and intentionally with our instruction from headquarters with state and local law enforcement. AFT is working on combating and getting rid of ghost guns, which I think we've just seen another deadly consequence of the way those move. The Department of Justice is developing a red flag program so that people who are already vulnerable and identifiable as at risk do not lay their hands on guns. There's going to be zero tolerance for rogue gun dealers. And we're working with the Veterans Affairs Department on a public education campaign about the safe storage of firearms in homes and in public spaces. All that said, we are still calling upon the Congress to act to make sure that criminals do not get their hands on guns and that weapons of war are not on our streets.
I'm going to talk about economic recovery. A little bit. The economic consequences of the COVID pandemic are really devastating on some of our Asian American commerce districts and small businesses. The Fed has now announced that they're going to rebalance their balance sheet and they're going to stop support for that they had previously given for over the last 2 years, making it imperative for these businesses to be able to stand on their own if they can. This economic recovery has got to impact all of us. including a really tight labor force and dual working families especially. And it impacts both economic and mental health. So I'd like you please to tell us, what are the financial resources like grants or loans that small businesses can get that will help them now? Are there names that you can give to people who they can call and say, hey, I need this help? And what programs are there now? Because with the announcement that the support seems to be lessening from the federal government, whether it's from the Fed or somebody else, there's that perception that says, okay, now I've got to either sink or swim. Is there support?
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things that I hear about a lot when I work on equitable economic policies for the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community, and again, this is in the broader context of the overarching cornerstone program that we have nationally that you hear about on national, cable news or things of that nature, but to make sure that it's specific to, tailored to, and available and accessible to Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander business owners and entrepreneurs. One of the things that's notable to me is how many people say PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, or the Restaurant Revitalization Investment Program that was enacted very early in President Biden's term, that it was a lifeline, that it saved their businesses. And yet, the flip side of that are the stories of folks who were not able to stay in business for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with, I'm not going to bore y'all with appropriations versus authorizations and whatever the Fed lending facility is, or the political will, but problems that predated the pandemic, a lack of financial literacy, a lack of banking relationships that would have made it easier for this first in line programming. Now, while there's no PPP or Restaurant Revitalization Acts currently open for application, the Small Business Administration does have a chart that helps entrepreneurs and small business owners navigate which programs they are available for. There's 7A loans. There are a lot of other programs that are online. And they also are granting, loan forgiveness for both the PPP program and the EIDL program, the Economic Injury Distress Loan Program. Thank you. I did an acronym without having to look it up. And there are also, a new pilot, which is a kind of a sample programming for community navigators through the SBA, through the Small Business Administration, where selected groups that are deep within community are empowered to basically represent and provide access to and a point of entry to what the federal programming looks like for grant making. The MBDA, the Minority Business Development Agency. I'm such a bad vet. I can't do the acronyms. Also, as a point of entry deep in communities for small businesses to understand and appreciate and access and succeed with programming, and for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community, MDBA reached 500 AA and NHPI entrepreneurs last year and 400 young AA and NHPI entrepreneurs under existing programs. And so these are different, touchstones and points of entry that we hope to make better known and better utilized and better resourced, so that these aren't just programs that get thrown out through Washington, D.C., but they're actually accessible and used. The utilization rate is something that the economic team and I have worked on a lot, and we've actually found ways to improve some of the programs because of these learnings.
Is that a fully funded program, the MDBA? MBDA.
So it's been reauthorized, and we are waiting for fresh authorizations to keep it expanded. It's actually been in the last bill. The new law has established it on a permanent basis instead of having to be reauthorized periodically. It's also elevated the leadership to a Senate-confirmed undersecretary at the Department of Commerce.
So it's pretty permanent then.
Yeah, pretty permanent.
Let me just chime in really quick too on just everything Erica said is, true. So there are so many resources at the federal government in terms of funding, as well as just also initiatives, ways to support small businesses and local communities. And we know that our small businesses in particular took a really hard hit throughout COVID, because long before we even had our first confirmed COVID case in America, and before we saw lockdowns and closures, our businesses were being impacted because of misconceptions about how the virus was transmitted. At the time, we didn't really know much about it, but we started to hear in January of 2020 Asian American businesses being impacted because people were afraid to go there. They thought, if you go to a Chinatown business, that you're going to get COVID somehow because the virus came from China. And so that, of course, was not true. But in terms of we learned later that's not how the virus was transmitted, but people had all of these stereotypes about Asian Americans that we have seen, unfortunately, has really manifested in this increase in anti-Asian hate. But our businesses were impacted very early on in the pandemic and continue to face very devastating losses. And so to Erica's point, there are so many opportunities through the federal government. A lot of legislation and funding was passed over the past 2 years to be able to provide resources directly into communities, including our small businesses. And I think one of the main goals that we have through the White House initiative, as well as with the role that Erica plays, is to ensure that our communities understand those programs and initiatives and what's available to them. And so, through, I had mentioned our regional network, we have held several sessions here in Region 9, including in Northern California, where we've been able to share resources directly from the Small Business Administration, from other components like the Minority Business Development Agency, to ensure that our communities know about these programs. And it's not just COVID relief specific. There are other, as Erica mentioned, there are other loan programs and grants that are available that I think are unfortunately underutilized by our communities because they don't know about them. And so we have really tried to do more to ensure that there is greater awareness, but also that we're doing more to ensure that these are being done in a linguistically and culturally sensitive way, because we know that so many of our small business owners do not speak English. So we can't just blast something out in, DC and in English and just assume they're going to read it in a press release. We really have to do that intentional engagement, working directly, providing the language translations, providing also the technical assistance that's needed so that these small businesses are not only aware, but can actually actively compete for some of this funding that's available. And that is something that we are very committed to doing through our initiative.
So we're moving forward. I think one of the things this week, especially yesterday, is the country has moved forward with the confirmation of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson as our
Justice Jackson.
And so that is a wonderful thing. This president has led by example in nominating and keeping a promise of African-American justice on the Supreme Court. The two of you are obvious embodiments of a representation mindset. Yet across America, in businesses and in schools, there's a lack of representation of AANHPI people in office, in the boardroom especially, in the C-suites, which decisions are being made as heads of school, etc. What opportunities do you see with your national portfolio for AANHPI people to be involved in the federal government in trying to make this a better world? Not all of us can be associate justices of the Supreme Court, but what opportunities are there for AANHPI people, and especially in the legal field? When do we get a Asian American Supreme Court justice nominee?
So I know that this is actually part of the executive order that you're executing, but if I could take a little bit of more of a top line piece of it.
Sure.
And first of all, congratulations, America. We have got a historic Supreme Court justice, and it was the work of coalition and heart and commitment. Our colleague Howard O and the Office of the Vice President was convening multiple time a week strategy sessions and information sharing sessions with Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander civil rights leaders several times a week because of their excitement for this historic nomination, what it means to have somebody with that lived experience, with that diversity of experience, to place another woman. Now we're going to have a majority woman Supreme Court for for the first time ever. It's a really heady day, and I'm here and not in the Rose Garden with Justice Jackson and the President. I'd rather be here because this is like super lovely, but. I'll watch it on C-SPAN later, which is almost the same thing. But I would also mention in terms of the pipeline, and this is little known just because I'll name names. Leader McConnell and the former president had done so much aggressive work in confirming judges under the last administration. One little known fact is that this administration has confirmed more judges to the federal bench in a shorter period of time than some presidents have done their entire first terms in office. And it includes district court members and appellate court members. 18% Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders, including multiple first evers, not just, the first half Japanese, half Latino to sit on a district court in Colorado, although that is true, but the first, Muslim, the first immigrants, just nationwide. Our president loves to have, be the one to shepherd first evers, but it's our vice president who says, pretty soon we're going to run out of first evers, and we don't ever have to talk about it again because it's a new standard operating procedure. Now, with respect to corporate America versus the federal government, I've been in this business long enough, this business called policy and politics, to actually expect the private sector to lead and to show the art of the possible and build the data and build the business case for doing innovative things that the federal government is honestly just a little bit too clumsy or large to be able to accomplish. With respect to diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, the federal government is leading under President Biden and Vice President Harris in terms of what it looks like to be a model employer. And I'm very, very proud to be a part of that. And just speaking, kind of more generally, this also helps us to understand and learn and build our coalition building muscle, because we're in this together, and a more diverse workforce creates, and I think for those of you in the private sector, you would agree, if you could put aside the bottom line in a quarterly basis, it produces a better product because of the tensions and the different viewpoints that were brought to bear. And that's what we're seeing in this government now. I'm very, very proud of being a part of an administration that looks like America. That was the president's commitment. And he is making good on it. Within the White House, 17% of White House officials identify as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. And that is compared to our almost 7% national census population. So we are far outperforming it. And this includes commissioned officers at the highest levels. In the agencies, 15% of all agency appointees, and that's my dear friend Crystal as well, identify as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander, 15% compared to, again, a little bit less than 7% of our national census population. And these aren't just, so the models that we see are also in the type and visibility of some of the models. We've got Vice President Harris, need I say more? We also have a cabinet member in Ambassador Catherine Tai, who's the first Taiwanese, first Asian American woman to lead USTR. Kiran Ahuja is the head. We have heads of agencies, Office of Public Personnel Management, managing, I think, one of the largest workforces in the nation. Lena Khan is the chair of the Federal Trade Commission. Chantel Wong is our ambassador to the Asian Development Bank. Julie Su is our Deputy Secretary of Department of Labor, proud Californian. And last week, I had the occasion to be at the swearing in of Nani Claretti as the Deputy Director of OMB, of the Office of Management and Budget. So I think that in terms of DEIA, diversity, and recognizing and valuing it and putting it into action, I think it's time for the corporate America to catch up with the feds.
We are moving, we've already moved into some of the questions that the audience has asked, and that was one of the questions that was asked. So I'm trying to batch these as well as I can, but there may be a little bit of jumping around on this, so I apologize for
Okay,
that.
Crystal's here to answer the hard one.
So from online, are you concerned that the rise in Asian hate won't go down over time, that it is actually here to stay?
No, because it's not sustainable, it's not endurable, and it's not acceptable. The president has said that it will not stand, it is un-American, and it will not stand. And we have some tools in place. And this is one of the challenges of this moment that we're in, because one of the things that is very prominent in my thinking and the way that we bring it back and the way we talk about it in Washington, D.C. amongst policymakers is that it's not an on-off switch. This is not a phenomenon that just turned on the first time somebody made a derogatory comment suggesting that the pandemic was sourced deliberately by a Chinese person. One of the things that we need to acknowledge and recognize and educate our colleagues about, and our fellow citizens and our allies and our neighbors and our classmates, is that this kind of hate and violence has predated the pandemic. It has been long-standing. It dates back to 1872 with the passage of the Page Act, which preceded the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is usually thought of as the first explicitly racist law on the books. But the Page Act actually was a combination of racism and misogyny, where women from China were prohibited broadly from immigrating to the United States because they were suspected to be dirty or prostitutes. And this is law. And you look at the arc of history that's brought us to, let's say, the pandemic, and you see over and over and over like instances of this kind of hatred, discrimination, and violence. Some of it state-sponsored, some of it sanctioned or looked the other way, and it includes the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. It includes the murder of Vincent Chin. It includes the mass murder of Southeast Asian children in Southern California. It includes mass murders of Sikh Americans.
So how do we prevent that sort of violence? I mean, obviously, the Exclusion Act was repealed, so that's one way of taking it off the books. But is it coalition building with other communities of color? Is it a massive training like we all have to do in corporate America on DEI every day, every week? What does it take to prevent this sort of thing? And does our world stance towards China affect the perception of Americans domestically for AE and HPI people?
So let me just say real quick, I think, it's all of what Erica said is true. Part of it is we have to teach people about our history, our contributions as a community to this country, and that's a big focus of our White House initiative. It is not just how do we deal with hate crimes or hate incidents after the fact, after people have been victimized and or killed. How do we actually look at prevention as a proactive model? And also, and big part of that is not just looking at, okay, how do we build coalition, but also how do we build awareness of our communities, of our histories, and educate people so that we are truly included and that we belong in this country. And I think, a lot of that is tied to being able to talk about this history of discrimination. As Erica mentioned, this is not new. We have been dealing with this for centuries. We have, so many instances of, unfortunately, of laws that were passed specifically to exclude our communities. We are still dealing with stereotypes, whether it is the model minority myth or the perpetual foreigner stereotype, that people just do not see people who look like us as Americans, and that's problematic. And so, in order to really get to the root cause of how do we actually address and stem the tide of anti-Asian bias and hate, we really do need to ensure that people are educated and aware of our communities, that they see us as Americans and as people who vibrantly contribute to this country with long histories in this country. And for me, of someone who is, both Asian American, but also Native Hawaiian descent, there's a whole separate, history that Native Hawaiians have faced in this country and Pacific Islanders that is also not discussed, but also important for us to discuss in terms of broader awareness and education about the contributions of our diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities. I also think that, to Erica's point, we will see, this is not going to be forever. We really do need to address this surge in anti-Asian hate. And the president and vice president have made it very clear that they are strongly committed to doing that. As Erica mentioned earlier, I mean, within his first week in office, the president issued his presidential memorandum to condemn and combat xenophobia and racism against our communities. He's signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. He's done a number of things, but as you know, actually I'm going to take this from Erica, as she says often, you can't legislate against hate. So you can't just by passing a law or condemning an action change people's mindsets overnight. So again, we do know that there's, again, things that we can do proactively through the federal government to address hate and prevention. But we also know that some of this is going to take time. We're going to have to really change hearts and minds, and that does not happen by the stroke of a pen, by signing legislation. It's going to really require all of us coming together, building that awareness, but also building, again, those coalitions that we had discussed, making sure that we have allies who are going to speak up for us. If they see something happening, if there's a crime happening in front of them, that we actually are going to have bystanders who will be willing to speak up and not just turn the other way. And so I think, again, a lot of that is raising awareness. It requires us to also be outspoken as a community, which I know is not always comfortable, but I think we have seen over the past 2 years our community mobilized and really be vocal in ways we have not seen historically. And that is so important, because if we're silent in the face of this violence and this hate, nothing's going to get done. So again, it's been really critical to be able to report incidents of hate, be able to come together and collectively talk about our trauma, but also discuss ways that we can also heal together. And that is, I think, a big role that we are hoping to play through our, through this administration and through the roles that Erica and I have, letting our communities know that we're not alone, that this is not an isolated incident. There are issues that are impacting our communities, but it is so important that we talk about them and collectively work to address them, and to know that they have allies in the federal government who are actively working to do that, from the president and vice president to all of our federal officials. And again, working very closely in coalition with our state and local governments, but also with community leaders directly to address this really tragic uptick in anti-Asian hate we have seen.
So let's talk about that. So there is, the hate crimes, we see it as an uptick, but we also think that they're also maybe underreported as to what violence is actually occurring. Some of the hate crimes that are reported are dismissed by prosecutors or charging officials as actual hate crimes. They could be an outgrowth of mental health, whatever activity, whatever. What do we do to address the further victimization of people who are reporting crimes against themselves in the justice system?
So I think it's a combination of two things. I mean, first of all, empowering the community leaders who are trusted by the community, which is one of these new grant programs that's just coming online because we were finally able to get funding for it. It was authorized. It was a new program that Ms. Meng from New York City had put into the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And what it does is it invests in community-based organizations, talking to community members in trusted ways. I think the second piece is more, so that's on the community side. Because there is no trust, and I mean, we talk about building trust. It's both building trust with law enforcement and scary, government apparatuses, but it's also rebuilding because we've broken so much trust. And so the underreporting, really comes to two things. I mean, the first is the lack of training for a beat cop to be able to identify, mark up, and then advance something that had a hate animus evidence, so that it could be possibly pursued or possibly not as a hate crime. And if that beat cop doesn't do that, or ignores, or somebody is ashamed because they have been victimized, and this is a for real thing that I've actually labored under personally too, is like the shame and embarrassment of being a victim and like having to give voice to it and talk to a stranger about it. That's really hard to do.
It's hard in the Asian community. The mental health component of stigma is really hard.
Or the fact that it's been so normalized that, we used to call them microaggressions. They're aggressive aggressions, and they're having deadly consequences. And that narrative, that feeling of shame and recalcitrance to be able to report it is reinforced even in our allied spaces too, because we've treated it as normal, or to brush it off, or everything will be okay. It's not okay. And so the training of law enforcement and the encouragement and finding out and determining and then implementing more culturally competent ways of building that reporting mechanism, that faith that the system does work and it works for us, is part of the build exercise that we need to dig into aggressively and intentionally.
Yeah, I'll just say, echo everything that Erica said. And then especially when it comes to the training, that is where the federal government can play a role. And in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that the president signed into law last year, actually, there is specific, there's a provision in there for training of state and local law enforcement to ensure that they're able to better identify what a hate crime is. We unfortunately, till this day, we know that there's a large underreporting of hate crimes. We have regularly localities that report 0 hate crimes every year, when we know that is not, that cannot statistically be possible. So, there's a lot of training that needs to happen, and education and awareness of our own state and local law enforcement, so that they're able to better, identify hate crimes, and also to, meaningfully engage with with our members of our community who are going to them with, asking for help and wanting to report and not wanting to be dismissed. And so, and to Erica's point too, ensuring that there's cultural competency as well as language access for our communities is really key. And that is something that the Department of Justice has prioritized, ensuring that not only can you report in English and Spanish, but also creating the forms in multiple languages for the Asian American community, because they know that, again, oftentimes if you just go to a website or look at a form, and if it's not accessible to our communities, there's no way to report that, especially for those who have language barriers that they are facing, and for our limited English proficient communities. So that is something that we have really intentionally done through the Department of Justice too, making sure that there is that cultural competency and that language access for our
Health
communities.
and Human Services has done a really extraordinary job too.
Absolutely. And on the mental health piece, absolutely. So the president in his State of the Union has talked about mental health being a priority, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where our White House initiative is actually based, and it's co-chaired by HHS Secretary Javier Becerra and U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Tai. Again, a big part of the work we are doing is also to figure out how can we better address the stigma and ensure that we are able to collectively deal with this trauma that our communities have faced. And so there have been a number of really great things being done. Secretary Becerra kicked off just last month a mental health tour. And as part of that, too, as we kind of hit that 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa murders, our White House initiative also held a series of virtual roundtables to be able to share a number of resources from the federal government, both from the Department of Justice, but also from the Department of Health and Human Services on mental health. How do we strengthen, just opportunities for our communities to be able to report mental health, again, with that cultural competency, with that language access that's needed? How do we talk about a lot of the trauma that we faced, and so we were able to share a number of resources from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. There was $3 billion that was allocated in the American Rescue Plan funding specifically for mental health services and substance use block grants, and also the Department of Health and Human Services recently rolled out nearly $300 million to support the implementation and launch of a 3-digit 988 national suicide prevention lifeline that'll be happening. And so, I think what we're seeing is, as we're reemerging from the pandemic, there have been unfortunately so many crises our communities have faced, and so the need for mental health services is more important now than ever. And yet Asian Americans are just unfortunately very rarely talk about mental health issues and utilize services. So that is something we're really trying to kind of break down that stigma and let people know it is okay to be able to access resources, and it is important that they get help, especially given the trauma that our communities have faced due to this rise in anti-Asian hate, the victimization, the lack of just really feeling safe and included in this country. And so that is something, again, we really want to make sure we are sharing those resources with Americans all across the country, and hopefully able to break down some of those barriers that our communities face when it comes to accessing mental health services.
Julian, do you mind if I pull 2 threads together?
You can, absolutely.
Okay.
This is, I'm telling you, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to get to another question, but I would welcome you pulling the thread together.
I'll talk super quick. I don't want to close on this somber note, because it is somber times. I wanted to lay out by pulling 2 threads about, can hate crimes ever be abated, and what are the resources? I want to pivot our thinking to one of power and resilience in our community, because that is what we have proven. We are not just victims, we're not just vulnerable, we're not just the scapegoat that's convenient, we're not just expendable. Look at what we've come through, how much we've been able to contribute as a collective community, and where we're going to go. And that was just the thread that I wanted to pull, because that is something that I deeply believe in. I worry that that we're reinforcing this idea of the perpetual victim, when really when we were in Atlanta, what I saw there was strength and power, not weakness and fragility. And that is the present and the future that we're working towards.
I can't think of a better way to end this. I want to thank you, Crystal Ka'ai and Erica Moritsugu, for taking the time to be here in San Francisco in person with us. It's been our great delight and pleasure and privilege to hear directly from you. Thank you for candidly sharing all the information that you've given to us. I want to thank all of you for taking the time of your day to spend time with us. And for those of you online, thank you for spending time with us and for submitting your questions. I'm Julian Chang. On behalf of the Commonwealth Club, this program is now adjourned. Thank you.